what do you know about the Middle Ages, medieval times? Like, what do you really know? I'm joined this week in this episode with Steve Weidenkopf. He's one of my favorite writers, historians who talks about the Middle Ages. He digs into all the different kinds of sources and distills this stuff for us, looks into primary documents and all kinds of stuff to give us a picture of what was actually going on. You'd be surprised, as I was, to realize how many myths there are about the Middle Ages, and really just digging a bit below the surface, looking at some of those events and those times in the actual words of the people who lived there and experienced those things. Be surprised how different it can be from what our conceptions of those time periods are, and what the church and the laity, those Catholics on the ground, were actually doing. The Crusades, the Inquisition, what was actual Catholic faith like in the Middle Ages? That's our topic for today, for this episode. I think you'll love it. Steve is a fantastic historian, a great storyteller. You will, I think, get absolutely enthralled in the way he tells the story of the Middle Ages. It's a great episode. I think you'll love it. If you want to support this show and the work we're doing here, please head over to patreon.com/cordialcatholic. We have a podcast as well. Check out The Cordial Catholic on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you find it. And thank you. Please do subscribe to this YouTube channel if you can, and hit the bell for notification. I think I'm supposed to say that on YouTube. It's all kind of new for me. Anyway, enjoy this episode with Steve Weidenkopf on some of the myths of the Middle Ages. Please watch and enjoy. Hey friends, and welcome back to the show. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to viewers on the YouTube channel. Thank you for being here. Gonna have a great discussion this week. I'm joined by returning guest, Steve Weidenkopf. Steve is a lecturer in church history at the Christendom College Graduate School of Theology. He's the author of some fantastic books, including Timeless, A History of the Catholic Church, The Real Story of Catholic History, Answering 20 Centuries of Anti-Catholic Myths, The Glory of the Crusades, and The Reformation, a Catholic Answers 20 Answers series booklet. His latest book is The Church and the Middle Ages, a book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series, edited by our mutual friend and guest of this show, Mike Aquilina. Steve, thank you for being here. Welcome back to the show, and hello.
Hey, greetings, Keith. Thanks so much for having me on the show again, and glad to be here and to talk about my latest book and all great things Catholic, I guess.
Absolutely. It's been a little while, but I'm happy to have you back, and I've missed you because it's always fun talking to you. We have great discussions. And a topic I love very dearly, history, of course. I read my way into the church as an evangelical, large part due to history, looking at the history of Christianity, and found that it looked very Catholic. So there you go.
Excellent.
There are a lot of myths of the Middle Ages. You know this. And I think a lot of them began in the Enlightenment, maybe as early as that. This kind of push back against religion and science as the be-all and end-all, and then everything else religious is silly and kind of a joke. It's continued, of course, in movies and television and in popular history. I mean, I took undergraduate level history courses on church history, and it's presented as this age of darkness, of depravity, of religious extravagance, and the masses being kind of held down by this powerful church. But you begin to dig under the surface and peel the layers back, as you do in your books, and you see a lot of myth in that popular, very popular kind of narrative. So can we begin there? What were the Middle Ages really like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Keith. And you set this up nicely because it's true, right? The modern understanding of this time period is one that's, as I mentioned in the book, it's, brutish and barbaric and dark and, full of superstition and religious zealotry and all kinds of, horrible things that the modern world abhors. But when you look at even the name itself that we developed for this period of time, the Middle Ages, was originally derived and used in a pejorative pejorative sense, right? It was a term created to describe, well, you had the ancient world when things were great, and there was this flourishing of learning and classical architecture and art, and the advancement of humanity. And then the Roman Empire fell or collapsed in the West in the 5th century, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket, so to speak, for several centuries until you get to the Renaissance, and then a revival of classical learning and art and architecture, and everything's great again. And then we have the modern world. And so this middle period was a negative and bad thing. But so that's part of the problem, right? Is that this term we've used to describe it is, first of all, pejorative, and second of all, it's so large. Right, it encompasses so many centuries that it's just really not even useful as a term. And there's a big debate in the academic community about whether to even use the term Middle Ages anymore. Is it proper? Is it not proper? And I try to argue in the book that we can use the term, at least instead of getting rid of the term, let's reclaim the term, right? Let's reclaim it, especially for what it really represented. What the medieval period represented really was a vibrant period of just intense activity in a lot of spheres of human life, right? There was intense spiritual activity. We'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but there was a spiritual revolution that occurred through this period of time, right? With the flourishing of the creation of brand new religious orders that still exist in the church today. This is a period of intense military activity, the time of the crusades and great military campaigns, oriented for a holy cause. This is a period of great intellectual activity. Some of the greatest theologians in the history of the church lived during this period of time. And not only that, but you have which I also try to bring out in one of the subtitles, or as part of the subtitle of the book, is this is a time of the cathedrals, right? This is a great advancement in architecture. What we commonly call Gothic architecture, which probably is more better termed French style architecture, with the advancement of all of the different architectural techniques that Abbot Suger develops first initially in Paris and then continue by later architects. But these massive, magnificent buildings built by these people of faith, with a vibrant and active and real faith, still exist centuries later for people like you and I to go and wander around and be amazed at.
Yeah, I think one of the things I love about this book is you end the first chapter, I think it is, of the book talking about the cathedral as a picture of medieval piety. And I love the idea of people, an expression of the faith of these people. It wasn't as we commonly hear this idea of these people oppressed by the church and the Bible chained to the pulpit. It was an expression, I think, better understood as these people built these cathedrals, like brick by brick, and that's an expression of their piety in a very tangible, real sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned in the book, and it's true that, the building of these cathedrals was a communal event. The entire town, the entire city, the village is, contributed to the building of these cathedrals. The Chartres Cathedral in France, one of the most magnificent Gothic style architecture cathedrals. We have accounts of the whole town, like people from the town taking time off of work and their business and their activities to go to the stone quarry, miles away, and to haul stone to the construction site for the building of the cathedral. Some of these took like 100 years or more to build as well. So these were generational type of activities, true, and something that's that huge and would take that long to construct. In reflecting the faith and vibrant faith of these people, isn't reflective, or doing that, I guess I should say, is not reflective of a society that felt oppressed, right? Of a society that was controlled, if you will, by the church. These were voluntary expressions of people's, love for their village, love for their city, love for their area, their region, but even more importantly, love for Christ and the church. And that's why they develop so much time, energy, and money and effort into these great, wonderful edifices.
Yeah, I guess maybe a modern day comparison is people like you and I who are in love with the faith start a podcast or write books and teach, right? The lady at this time couldn't do those things. They were illiterate. They expressed their faith in the way that they could. Is that fair to say?
No, that's absolutely fair to say. Yeah, they express their faith through participating in the building of these cathedrals. They express their faith, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, later in the podcast here, with by going on crusade. Even, they express their faith in a multitude of ways, just living their faith. And that's the thing that I bring out in the book too, that is so different from the medieval period of time from our own period of time, is that. And why I think modernity struggles so much with understanding the medieval period is because of two things, really: how medieval society was structured, and the importance of the faith in medieval society. Right. So you can't really understand the Middle Ages or the medieval period without understanding the Catholic Church and the role that the Church had in the lives of these people, and even great, secular medievalists, people of no personal faith in the modern world, they recognize that and know that they have to understand the church. They have to understand the church's teachings in order to truly understand how the contemporaries that they're studying in this medieval period, how they lived, how they thought, and why they acted and made the decisions that they did. Because you can't understand it without viewing it through their lens of faith, and through the lens of the structure of their society, which was very hierarchical and not democratic in the way that we experience things in the Western world.
Yeah, and we today, as much as we shouldn't, separate our faith and our I don't know, normal life in many cases, right? There's a separation there sometimes. There shouldn't be, according to Christ, when he says in the gospel, there shouldn't be that division. But there often becomes that because our workplaces are secular in many cases, or our communities are secular. And then there's our church communities and our parishes. But there is that separation that wouldn't necessarily have existed in the Middle Ages. So right there's a huge challenge in understanding and putting ourselves in those shoes, right?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, the faith was integral, right, to life in the medieval period. So medieval people wouldn't have understood any kind of society where faith wasn't that integral part. It pervaded all aspects of society. The liturgical year. I mean, you and I, we know the liturgical year because we're faith-believing, practicing Catholics. So we know what year we're in, what color is in the church and whatnot, and what vestments, color vestments the priest and deacon wear. But so we're aware of that. But I think it's not far to say that most people in our modern world wouldn't know that, right? Don't know that. They would, if you walked up to somebody on the side of the street and say, "Hey, what time of the liturgical calendar are we in?" Look at you like you're crazy, right? They wouldn't know. Maybe they could say, "Oh, I think I saw green this past Sunday." I mean, maybe not. They might, but in the medieval world, people would know immediately, right? Because their whole lives were based on the liturgical calendar. Frankly, I mean, as I mentioned in the book, serfs in particular, as difficult as laboring was in an agricultural way, which was the predominant, way of commerce. It was the predominant, the land was, it was the predominant, way in which people worked. Peasants, worked in the fields and whatnot, but which was hard, laborious type of work and backbreaking work, but there was still built-in time for rest and relaxation into their work schedule because of the liturgical calendar of the church. So solemnities were always days off from work. Saints' festivals, patron saints of your, the patron saint of your town or your village or your region, you'd have that day off from work. You wouldn't have to do the heavy labor, hard labor involved in agricultural work. So, one historian's estimated that there were 100 days off, right, of work a year for the average medieval peasant because of the church's cycle of saints and feast days and whatnot. So, which was a bonus, and people just knew that, and they lived that, and they understood that. It was just a part of who they were, which, as you point out, is not something. It's a bit foreign to us in the modern world.
Yeah, absolutely. We should reinstate the church calendar as the the state calendar. That sounds pretty good. Apart from the hard labor, of course.
Yes.
So I want to jump through some topics of your book here and encourage readers to pick, or listeners to become readers and pick up a copy. I want to go through the papal reform movement and the investiture kind of scandal. What was the papacy and the church-state relationship like during the Middle Ages? Because oftentimes we hear that it was very entwined for all kinds of terrible reasons, and there is some truth to that. But can you give us a sketch of what that relationship was like between the church and the state and the pope and the bishops happening during the Middle Ages?
Yeah, sure. So that's actually one of the major characters of the story of the church in the medieval period, right? Is this church-state relationship, and which is speaks to us in the modern world, frankly, because we do have that tension in our world between church and state. And I think sometimes we get this sense that because the church and the faith in particular was so a part of medieval life, that church and state in the medieval period were somehow in lockstep, like there was some kind of theocracy or some the church controlled the state or things like this, which is far from true, right? There's always been really in the Western part of the world this healthy tension between church and state, between secular rulers and spiritual rulers, between bishops and popes and kings and others. And so what you have here in the medieval period is, as you get towards the 11th century, mid part of the 11th century, there's really this massive, what's known, various terms for it, but in generally it's the papal reform movement. And what happens is it begins as an internal reform movement, and then it also has external manifestations as well. And what I mean by that is that internally you had during this time a series of or problems within the church, right? Frankly, especially within the clergy. You had the rampant abuse of what's known as simony, or the buying and selling of church offices, where people could become a bishop if they paid enough money to do so, right? If they could pay off their secular lord and receive the, or they could send money, even to Rome later on and receive the office. So this is a significant problem, significant abuse, right? And it stems from the Acts of the Apostles, where the magician Simon Magus comes and tries to get the gifts of the Holy Spirit from the apostles by giving them money. So you have simony. That's a problem as you get to the 11th century church. There's also a significant problem of clerical immorality as well, in terms of men not living the promise of chastity in the clerical orders. So you have openly at this time clerics living with concubines, clerics having mistresses, living openly with them and their children, as if they're married, which was forbidden by canon law. You have rampant homosexuality, even frankly, in the monasteries in particular throughout Christendom. So this is a significant crisis. And what you have is, as you get to the middle of the 11th century, you get some monks who come out of the Reformed monastery in France, known as Cluny, and these monks become pope. And they begin to, and others like them, reform-minded individuals, become very, get positions of authority and power in the church, especially the papacy. And so when you get to the pontificate of St. Leo IX in the middle of the 11th century, he really begins this internal reform movement where he goes on this road trip throughout Christendom. Spends, frankly, most of his pontificate on the road, not in Rome, because while he's doing that, is he goes to these local synods all throughout Christendom, and he institutes and implements these reform decrees against simony, decrees stating, that clerics have to live in accordance with the vow of chastity. And so, and then he goes to these areas to implement that and enforce that. And he deposes bishops who, are engaged in these abuses and gets rid of bad clerics and things like that. So it starts as this internal reform movement, this papal reform movement, and then later popes continue that as well. It becomes a continual fight throughout the 11th century, really, through St. Leo IX's pontificate. Blessed Urban II has to deal with this later in the 11th century, and even before him, Pope St. Gregory VII. It's still somewhat of an issue even into the 13th century. So this is something it's a continual issue that pops itself up back to later in the church's story in later centuries, sadly, and which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later maybe. But so you have this papal reform movement, internal, and then externally, how that manifests itself too, as you mentioned with the investiture controversy, is that there's a desire by these papal reformers to create a more independent situation for the church so that secular rulers are not influencing ecclesiastical affairs. So you don't have kings and lords and dukes, picking individuals to be bishops, or in giving bishops not only the symbols of their secular office, but also the symbols of spiritual office. And that's what the problem of investiture is. Sometimes people hear that term, investiture controversy. What is that? It's a very complex issue, but at the end of the day, it really is a situation that occurs mostly in Germanic areas in imperial territory, where you had the king of the Germans who utilized bishops as secular administrators, basically. So these were men and abbots as well. So you had men who were in charge of monasteries, men who were in charge of dioceses. They had spiritual roles and responsibilities, but they were also then given secular roles and responsibilities by the king. But the problem is that in the secular ceremony, where the king gave a spear or a staff or some secular symbol of authority to this individual. He would also then give the spiritual symbols of office. He would invest, hence the term investiture, he would invest the bishop, or this man who's occupying both roles, with the symbols of spiritual office, which was his ring and the crozier, symbols that bishops still use today. And so you have this situation where then it kind of becomes, the major problem becomes, well, who's really appointing the bishop? Is it the Pope? And is it the ecclesiastical world, or is it the secular world? Right? Does the secular authority have the power and ability to invest spiritual offices and spiritual power in an individual? And one in particular, Pope St. Gregory VII, decides that this is such a significant issue. It's a intrusion of the state into the church, that he bans the practice. And the king of the Germans at the time, Henry IV, sees that as a direct attack on his sovereignty, a direct attack on his ability to govern his lands. And so then he engages in a series of letters back and forth, and even events. He tries to depose Gregory VII. He gets into, he writes a really nasty letter to Gregory when he receives the news that Gregory has banned investiture. He calls him a false monk. He calls him by his given name, calls him Hildebrand instead of referring to him as Gregory VII. I mean, some nasty letters going back and forth between these guys. It was not a amicable type of dispute, if you will, right? Ultimately ends up in Henry bringing his army down to Rome. He besieges the city. The Pope, Gregory VII, has to ask for the Normans, who were in the south of Italy at this time, to come up and help him. They do, but then when they're there, they bring a large contingent of Muslim troops with them, and they sack the city of Rome for 3 days. The Roman people are upset. Gregory has to leave Rome, and he dies in exile, right? So there's this kind of interplay between an internal church reform, which then leads to other issues, which becomes an external church reform as well, and a big battle between church and state, which really pervades, again, the main story through most of these centuries here I cover in the book.
Yeah, it's quite a dramatic story too. It's quite a page turner. As you get into some of this history, it seems like the stuff of movies or a miniseries, right? That you could write for sure. It's interesting. One of the tidbits in here, and you mentioned it in passing, is the idea of clerical celibacy. And I mean, the what I was told in my undergrad church history courses was that the church forced clerics to be celibate because it was an issue of passing on church land to the children of their concubines or the children of their mistresses, and it became a whole issue of wanting to maintain church lands for the church. And there's a lot in here, I think, in the idea of clerical celibacy. And you already mentioned some of the problems, the not great things that were happening in the priesthood and in the clerical class. Can we flesh that out a little bit deeper? Because obviously it was in need of reform. It was being reformed. There was a movement to reform it. Mm-hmm. Was celibacy a part of this movement, or did this already exist and maybe was tightened up, or what's behind that?
Yeah, great question. And I covered this question specifically, even almost as you asked it, word for word, in another book that I wrote for Catholic Answers called, you mentioned it, The Real Story of Catholic History, is one of the entries in that book on clerical celibacy. And there is widespread belief. I mean, I remember hearing this as an undergrad too, back in the day, probably much longer ago than you were an undergrad. But that the church instituted this whole celibacy requirement because, again, they were concerned about all these men who were married, had children with land, and in certain areas of Christendom under the feudal system, you had this notion of primogeniture, where only the firstborn son can inherit the family's land. And so therefore, if you had priests who were married and they had children, then the land goes to them and the church becomes poorer, and they don't have. So it was this big land grab or land retention initiative by the church to enforce celibacy. And that's not remotely historically accurate whatsoever. So celibacy as a practice in the church, it's a discipline, small d discipline, that goes back to apostolic times. The early church actually very highly valued virginity, and there were priests who were not married who pledged, abstinence and lived a life of chastity. And this whole discipline has evolved over the centuries as well, so that in the early church there were priests who were married, but what's interesting when you peel the onion back on this and look at it in a little more detail with the historical record, that although married men were ordained as priests in the early church, they were not. There was no marriage after ordination. So once you were ordained, as a priest, you couldn't then marry if you were single, let's say, or if you were married when you were ordained and your wife died, you couldn't then take another wife, right? And even within, if you were married and you were ordained a priest, within that marriage, then you also practiced abstinence. So the church, has always valued this because it's a sign and a symbol and an imitation of Christ himself, right, who also was celibate. So it goes back to the early church. I mean, in the 4th century, you have definitely by the end of the 4th century, you have some church legislation, some actual documents that we have that legislate clerical celibacy in the West. The East follows a little bit different practice where you have married men ordained to the priesthood even to the modern day. But in the West, it becomes, again, initially in the 4th century, we have documentation of legislation about only, that priests are celibate in the West. And then what you have is over the centuries, though, that legislation wasn't as enforced as it should have been, right? Or in cases or in places, you have men who are just openly flaunting it, right? Not following the practice at all. So by the time you get to the 11th century, as I just mentioned, you have this huge problem of clerical immorality, where you have men who are promising that they will live celibate lives, but then are not doing so. And it becomes such an issue that it's no longer like a secret thing, like, well, I'll publicly, promise to live chastity or chastely, but I'll have a mistress on the side, and I'll try to keep it secret, and so maybe people won't see or know. But by the 11th century, it's just openly flaunted. I mean, you have priests openly living with women as wives and as mistresses and things like this. And it's not just that, right? So as I mentioned earlier, it's not this whole reform movement in the 11th century to regain the authentic living of this promise was not just oriented towards priests who are with women, but it was also a desire to eradicate the sin of homosexuality within the clerical state and within monasteries, because that becomes a serious, significant problem. So much so that you have one of the great saints of the church, St. Peter Damian, who wrote a book. He wrote a letter, actually, that later on receives the name, the Book of Gomorrah. He didn't call it that himself, but in this book, it's a multi-chaptered kind of long letter that he addresses to Pope St. Leo IX, saying, there's a significant problem of homosexuality in the clerical state, and you need to clean this up. You need to really enforce this. And Leo did so, at least initially. Later on, people kind of whispered in his ear that Peter Damian had a different agenda, so things were there was some politics involved, as shockingly, in the church. So that doesn't change. So things weren't as well enforced, maybe a little bit later on. But that always was an issue and a concern of these men at the time. And again, because they're faith-believing Catholics, right? They, just like today, you have people today that are upset with various, abuses or issues in the church. There were abuses and issues in the church in past centuries, and people tried to clean that up and to call, for greater reform and a greater renewal and a more authentic living of the Christian vocation.
And I guess, kind of as an aside, we'll mention this near the end because the Reformation kind of comes after this book of yours in history. But the church is always in need of reform and reforming, right? Itself. This is a narrative of the church since the beginning when Peter denies Christ, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely, yeah. I like to say that. When you study church history, we're studying the free-willed actions of men and women who have come before us, and sometimes they live fantastically, authentically virtuous lives, and many of them are recognized as saints by the church on the church's universal calendar. And some, we also see instances of people not living virtuous lives, of choosing poorly and of living, committing immoral activity. And that's the beauty, really, of church history, is that we can see the example of these men and women, and we can learn from them, right? And hopefully influence our own lives, and recognize too that each individual Christian, whether you're a pope, you're a bishop, or you're a simple layman, you're a podcast creator and content person, or a professor or whatever, we as Christians, right, we can either attract people to the faith by how we we live, or we can repel people from the faith by how we live. And it's true today. It was true in past centuries. We're all fallen yet redeemed creatures, and that doesn't change no matter what century you're living in. That's the human experience since the Garden of Eden. So, we just always have to keep that in mind and not judge too harshly the people who have come before us. But again, just try to learn from them, and so that we can make our world, a better place, and the church a better place as well.
Very well said. I want to go into the Crusades next. I mean, you've written entire books on this. You have a huge section in this book on that. Actually, your book on the Crusades holds a near and dear spot in my heart, because I was coming into the church when that book was being advertised on Catholic Answers. I'd hear on the podcast every time I'd go for a run by the river, advertisement for your book on the Crusades, and it was fantastic when I read it. So that book holds a special place in my heart in the history of my own faith journey, Steve. But there's a lot to say on the Crusades, and it's not one kind of homogenous thing either. You can't really just generalize this is the Crusades. There's different kinds of Crusades, but I think they are generalized in popular history as this one widely misunderstood thing. So can we unpack the Crusades a little bit? What was going on there, and what can we push back a bit against the modern kind of myths of the Crusade, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, Keith, thanks for telling me about the importance of the book there in your own life, and that's very heartwarming. So, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm glad that at least piqued your interest when you were doing your jogs and listening to the podcast and whatnot from Catholic Answers. But the Crusades are one of those things. One Crusade historian has said that the Crusades are one of the most well known but misunderstood events, right, in all of history. Frankly, I mean, most people have at least a mental image of what when they hear the word Crusades, they at least have an idea of what maybe it could be. The idea they have is mostly shaped by Hollywood and other kinds of presentations in the media, which are more often than not completely historically inaccurate, but nonetheless, there is at least a familiarity with the term, which historians can work with. But it is somewhat of a tall hill to try to convince people that what they see, from Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, for example, on the screen, is not really authentic or accurate in many ways, despite the fact that they're using names of historical people who actually lived, and talking about historical events, but their presentation of them is obviously wrong. So the Crusades, as you mentioned, it's a movement that begins in the 11th century, and it lasts for a long period of time. Frankly, I mean, depending on how you want to mark it, it's at least a 500 to 600 year, sometimes even more, depending on how you want to end it. But multiple centuries, right? That this movement is alive in the church and in the world, and so it develops over time. It doesn't say stagnant, but at the 11th century, it begins because of a unique situation that develops in the East. What happens is to set the stage, you have the Eastern Roman Empire, which we frequently call the Byzantine Empire, which was a later developed term. They never referred to themselves as Byzantines. They saw themselves as Romans. But so you have the Eastern Roman Empire with a seat in Constantinople with an emperor. And then you have one of the major provinces of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, was Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. And so you have in the 11th century this group of Muslim this tribe that's known as the Seljuk Turks. They come down from the Central Asian steppe, so they're Muslim, but they're not Arab. They come to the Anatolia plain, or Anatolia rather, the province, and they win a series of battles against the Eastern Roman Empire, including one called the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where they capture the Eastern Emperor. And this is a devastating blow. Over time, they then capture basically the entire province of Anatolia, and that's a huge problem for the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a very important province for them. A later emperor, Alexius Comnenus, actually sends a letter to the West. He sends representatives even as well to the Pope, asking for his assistance in getting military aid to send to the East to help the Eastern Christians fight off the Seljuk Turks. And so what he's envisioning when he writes this and asks us for this request is kind of what's been happening in the decades and in years before this period of time, where you would have Western warriors, in particular Normans, really, who would leave the West and go east and fight for a period of time. And they would fight for money. They were mercenaries. And that's what he's probably expecting. At least that's what he's hoping. But eventually, in the fall of 1197, 1198, he begins to see, or 1196, 97, he gets to see these massive amounts of, 1096, 1097. He sees all these people these Western warriors coming to Constantinople in large groups. Ultimately, 100,000 people show up, and he's mystified, stupefied. This is not what he was asking for or what he wanted. So how did this happen? Well, back in the West, his request for aid initially went to Pope St. Gregory VII, who had many things going on. We talked about his investiture controversy with King Henry here a little bit earlier. He's dealing with all that. He really can't respond. So it falls to a later Pope, Blessed Urban II, who's off as part of this papal reform movement in France at a town called Clermont, where he's participating in the local synod on reform decrees. And it's there that Blessed Urban II decides to preach what becomes later known as the First Crusade. And he begins and initiates this crusading movement. And he calls for warriors, Western warriors, to go to the East. And he knows that he's probably not going to be able to motivate them to go just to help the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire, right? At this point, we've had this little thing called the Great Schism, which is well known, the importance of which and the impact of which is debated today, of how important this Great Schism is, and was it really a great rupture between the two halves of the church? But regardless, people knew that there was issues with the Eastern half of the church. So he decides to, instead of making it an issue or a goal of going and helping the Eastern Christians, although that's part of it, he sets the goal of the liberation of Jerusalem. Let's go and let's liberate the city. This is Christ's city. It's under the yoke of Islam. It's being occupied. It's his Christian territory, which it was. It needs to be liberated. So he sends these individuals, or asks them to vow to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on an armed pilgrimage. And so that's what they participate in. And they do so, as I mentioned, in large numbers. And he attaches a spiritual incentive for people to do that, and it's the incentive of the indulgence. And so, he really frames this, and it's seen by contemporaries as an armed pilgrimage. They're going on a pilgrimage as you and I would go on pilgrimages today. They just are happening to go to a place that's not under Christian control. So they're going there to take control or to regain control of the territory as part of their pilgrimage. And that's what they do. So the First Crusade is actually fairly successful. It liberates the Holy City of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. And then they establish these feudal territories known as what we call the Crusader States, with all the territory that they had liberated. And then suddenly you have this about 200-year history of these different Christian areas in what is now the Holy Land in the Middle East. And then the movement continues and develops over time, and stretches into different campaigns in different areas and things. But
I'm sure you've heard all kinds of myths about the Crusades. What is maybe the most prevalent one that you would want to tackle to say that this, set right for those listening and watching?
Yeah, the most prevalent one is, which you hear all the time, is which I learned as an undergrad, frankly, is the reason why men went on crusade. Why did they go? This is a big question that people like to ask. And so sadly, this question is usually answered from a modern perspective, right? Usually it's answered, why did they go? Well, they went obviously for money. They went for land, they went for wealth. And this theory goes, which is I learned as an undergrad, was you had this population explosion in the 11th century in Europe, which is true. You did. Actually, the medieval population, or the population of Europe and Christendom, greatly increased during the 11th century. For a whole bunch of different reasons, right? Agricultural techniques changed and things like this. But anyways, don't want to get off on that tangent. So so you had this population explosion. So the idea was, well, they went on this crusade, and the church called for the crusade because of the feudal system in certain areas of Christendom. As I mentioned earlier, you had primogeniture, only the firstborn son inherits land. So the idea was you have all these second, third, and fourthborn sons that are fighting each other in Europe, and they're causing all kinds of civil war and mayhem, and they're attacking the church. And so the church decides, well, let's stop the infighting in Europe. Let's rally these troops and send them to the east to fight the Muslims. And there they can get their land and grab their booty and their plunder and all that great stuff. Which sounds great on the surface and sounds fairly logical, but again, it's answering the question, why did they go from a modern perspective? Because that makes sense to us. Obviously, they would do something like this for money or for some material benefit. But there was a British historian, Jonathan Riley Smith, who was the grandfather, if you will, of modern crusade studies. And he began to look at this in more detail, and he looked at some of the charters that were written, documents that we have from these people who would sell their land in order to finance their expedition because war is expensive. And they would say why they're going. And he found through his research that the vast majority of those who went on the first crusade in particular were the firstborn sons, not the second, third, and fourthborn sons. And then that makes people, well, why would that happen? That seems it throws that whole theory on its head. Well, the reason why the firstborn son went is because French families, in particular, most of the first crusaders were from France. French families saw how important this was, how significant of an event it was in the life of the church, in their lives, that they wanted their most prized possession, if you will, their most prized progeny, to participate, their firstborn sons. So that's who went. Second, third, and fourthborn sons went as well, but they went in, along with their older brother, if you will. So and they went because of this, really out of love. And you boil it all down, you look at the reasons that they left us as to why they went. Generally speaking, the vast majority went out of love for themselves. They were concerned for their own salvation. They wanted to receive that indulgence that the Pope attached to their participation in this armed pilgrimage. Again, because these are people that are motivated by faith, right? Which again, in modernity, we're not so much motivated by that in our day-to-day choices, which we should be, we could argue, but most people are not. But people then most assuredly were. So they went out of love for themselves and their own salvation. They went for love of God. The Pope had asked them to go and to liberate this territory, and they wanted to respond to his plea and his call. And they also went to help out of love for their fellow man. There were reports coming out of the East where indigenous Christians and Jews were being harassed by the Seljuk Turks and other Muslims, and even Christian pilgrims from Europe who were going to Jerusalem, not as part of the crusade, but just as a normal pilgrimage, were also being attacked and harassed and slaughtered as you get towards the end of the 11th century. And so news of those events was filtering back to Europe as well. So they were really motivated out of that, right? Out of a sense of love, motivated, guided by their spiritual understanding of this event that they were participating in, and desiring of these spiritual benefits for their for their own souls, which again is kind of a foreign concept for most people in modernity.
It is, right? And that's the challenge of looking at history like this. And then, of course, I think it's amazing that digging into the primary sources, those charters, are what reveals the actual, go figure, the actual motivations of the people who are doing these things. Look at their actual words, if we can, right? Rather than reading into it our modern kind of ideas. It seems straightforward, right? But along comes what you call the spiritual revolution. You touched on this earlier, too, kind of beginning in the 13th century with St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic. I want to know a bit about who these men were, and they're saints in the Catholic Church. We know these guys now, in hindsight. What was so revolutionary about these guys and their spirituality, though, at this time?
Yeah, so there really was. That's the best way to put it, I think, is a spiritual revolution, right? That what ends up happening is, so at this time, before this time in the church, let me take a step back. I think most of the time we don't see it that way as a spiritual revolution because we have Franciscans and Dominicans today, so they're kind of part of the normal part of the church, and we don't think anything differently of them, right? But their orders and the way that they focused and their charism were so radical for the time, because up until the 13th century, you basically had clergy, regular, what secular clergy they're called, we would call diocesan clergy. So clergy who were in a certain area, certain location, certain diocese, certain region. And then you had, religious who were in monasteries, really, right? Most of them Benedictines. There were other orders at this time as well, too. But, they're living in a communal life, that kind of thing. What you didn't have, which was revolutionary, was a group of men who pledge and vow to live the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but then don't live in community solely, but then they actually actively work and live in the world and do things in the world. That's what was unique. And not only to do that, the more unique thing was to be able to do those things, to live in the world, to preach and to teach and to do that. They focused on begging in order to sustain themselves, right? So they're known as the mendicant orders, mendicant from begging. And so that's what they did, right? The Franciscans and Dominicans lived extreme poverty as they lived those evangelical counsels, that counsel really authentically and radically. And so they sustained their activities by begging. They didn't sustain their activity by manual labor in the monastery, right? right, or working the lands associated with the monastery. They had to come up with a different way to finance their operations, if you will, and they did so by begging. And that was unique and radical for the time. And they were out in amongst the lay people doing things, right? They weren't just in the university later on, or they weren't just in their monastery. They were preaching and teaching and walking about, and that was radical. That was very revolutionary. So you have somebody like St. Francis, who initially begins his life as a soldier. Right? He's attracted to the military profession. He engages in warfare. He gets wounded, and then he has this massive spiritual conversion, and spends some time in solitude, growing his spiritual life, and then radically makes this radical departure to give everything up, give all of his riches, his wealth. He's denounced by his family, his father, in that great episode where he strips himself naked in the town square of Assisi and is clothed and by the bishop. And anyways, he begins this radical group known as the Orders of Friars Minor, and they go, and their major emphasis is to teach and to preach and to beg. And then you have Saint Dominic, who comes from Spain, modern day Spain, and he is traveling with his bishop in the south of France during the time at the late 12th, early 13th century, where you have this really pervasive heresy that has erupted all through the south of France, known as Albigensianism or Catharism, same thing, where you have this very Gnostic, semi-Gnostic group that's in the south of France that's attracting adherents to it because the clergy in the south of France is living immorally and is ignorant and is not teaching the faith or living the faith authentically. And so Dominic is in this area, and he sees this, and he sees the spread of this heresy, and he realizes that one of the reasons why it's spreading so rapidly is because the Catholic clergy in the area they're malformed. They don't know the faith. They can't adequately or authentically refute the erroneous teachings of the Albigensians. They're not teaching or preaching to people at all, and they're not living virtuous lives. So he feels called by the Holy Spirit to found the order of preachers, to do that, to go into these areas, especially where we're rampant with heresy, to preach and to teach authentic Catholic faith, and to live that faith as well, and to present that good example in the world. And so these two men start this revolution. They almost nearly at the same time, and they have about a decade to work before they die, but their orders continue after them, and to the point where obviously they're still around today. And eventually the orders change a bit, where the Dominicans always kind of had that focus on teaching and education. And later on, the Franciscans developed that as well, but that wasn't Francis's original idea for the order. But yeah, I mean, they to the point where they still have great institutions of higher learning that they're attached to today.
Yeah, remarkable revolution. Like really, that the first time that this is happening, these orders out in the world like that, it's amazing, and still, like you say, it's still in existence and vibrant and thriving today. It's amazing to be part of that church history. I mean, even today we're in that same stream, right, of these amazing revolutions. We're hitting all the good points here, and I want to hit the Inquisition next before we begin to round the corner. Like the Crusades, I think the Inquisition is one of those things that not necessarily homogenous, not one thing. Like the Crusades, there's different kind of varieties or branches, but understood again as this one homogenous, awful thing that history tells us was just the worst thing ever. Which we know there's I don't know, maybe truth in some abuses of this, but as a whole, I think we can push back against the narrative of what we're commonly understood in history. What can we say about the Inquisition? What can you unpack here for us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So let's do that in 5 minutes or less, right? No, it's like you mentioned. I mean, the Crusades, the Inquisition or the Inquisitors, is one of the most misunderstood, elements of church history. And modernity paints this, as you indicated, this picture of this omniscient, omnipresent, intolerant church that it's stifling religious freedom and thought throughout Christendom, torturing people and killing people by burning them at the stake by the millions, right? Because of they didn't believe what they're supposed to believe, that kind of thing. You get the famous Monty Python skit of the Spanish Inquisition, which no one expects, and the Mel Brooks sing along in History of the World Part 1. But those parodies aside, it's really important to understand what these events were. The Spanish Inquisition, frankly, falls outside of the time period in which I cover in the book, and that's a whole unique thing, so I really won't touch too much on that. But the medieval inquisitors begin during this period of time because of, as I just mentioned, with St. Dominic, you have this rampant heresy that erupted in the south of France of Catharism, and it was pernicious, and it was pervasive, and it was causing significant problems. And so there had to be a way to address it. And so the church addresses it through the creation of what are known as papal inquisitors, right? The medieval inquisitors. And at this time, it's appropriate to historically refer to them as that, right? At this time, in the 13th century, in the beginning of the 13th century, in the middle of the 13th century, there is no such thing as the Inquisition. There's no, one tribunal. There never was, frankly, one, all-pervasive tribunal that covered all of Christendom. I mean, you had the Roman Inquisition later on in later centuries that was influential in a certain sense through Christendom, but was very much had power over its own kind of territory, its own diocese. You had other inquisitions established. We mentioned the Spanish one, and they weren't all they weren't united or linked together and following each other's commands. They were all separately active and operating in their own respective areas. But the medieval inquisitors are much different, right? And the way to understand them is it's hard for us in the modern world. And it's one of the events that I spend a lot of time talking about when I go to parishes and things and give talks, because we don't understand the medieval worldview. You cannot understand the creation of the medieval inquisitors or the later institutional tribunals known as inquisitions unless you understand the importance of the faith in the medieval world. And you understand something extremely important, which most people don't know, is that heresy in the medieval world had a dual purpose to it. It was considered a significant problem and a crime in the church. It was an ecclesiastical crime, heresy. It was also, heresy was a secular crime. The secular world, the state, the secular authority viewed heresy with such vehemence that it was a capital offense. Right? It was punishable by death in the secular world. Now, why was that? Why is heresy considered to be so problematic for medieval man? Was it because they were intolerant, they were superstitious, they didn't know any better, they were ignorant? No. It's because the faith pervaded society to the point where the faith was seen as that which united society together. Even though you had, differences, regional differences, you had, later on national differences, but unity, as a whole was centered on the faith. And so when you look at heresy and the heretic was somebody who disrupted that unity. From a secular ruler's perspective, a heretic was someone who was really a threat to peace and security of his community. Because when you look at and you study the history of heresy, you see that every heresy and every heretical movement produces violence. Sometimes that's violence, that's unsanctioned against the heretic, by Catholic people and Catholic secular rulers. And other times that's violence, and sometimes together that's violence of the heretic against, Catholic people and Catholic rulers. Regardless, violence erupts, and secular rulers don't want violence, right? They want peace and security and people to prosper, which was what most people want. And so you have to deal with it. And so that's why they viewed it with such a high attention, and why it was considered a crime. So with all that, right, we have to understand the distinction. What we did begin to have problems with in the 12th century in the church in particular is you would have secular rulers who would take it on themselves to deal with heresy, and they would prosecute heresy, and heretics would die at their hands, but they weren't trained theologians, right? Secular people and secular rulers didn't know necessarily always whether somebody was actually speaking erroneously and heretically, or if they were just ignorant or were saying something just in error, but didn't fully and obstinately believe it. So the church really, as a matter of charity, institutes these procedures whereby someone accused of heresy could be then investigated by these papal inquisitors to determine whether or not they actually were heretics or not. And if they were, or if they did believe erroneously and heretically, they were given opportunity throughout the process to repent, to reconcile to the church, and to receive a penance. And in the vast majority of cases, both in the medieval inquisitors and also in the later institutional tribunals of, for example, the Spanish Inquisition, that's really what happened in the vast majority of cases. People were accused, they were brought forth, a trial would commence, you would have witnesses called both for and against the accused, you would have the accused be able to make a defense for themselves. Later on, they were given a lawyer and an advocate to help them in their defense. And then again, through the questioning by the inquisitors, if they were found to be in heresy or to be suspected of heresy, given opportunities to recant, repent, most did, received a penance of some form. Those who refused to recant and repent and held obstinately to their heresy the church then declared, well, we can no longer help you. We've given you opportunities to recant, to repent, to be reconciled. You refuse to do so. You have placed yourself outside of the church in terms of, outside of the community because you don't believe what one needs to believe to be in union with the church. And so therefore we remand you to the church would remand that person to the state. And then the state would then prosecute heresy on that individual. And as I mentioned, the state views heresy seriously, viewed it as a capital offense, and that person was then convicted of heresy in a secular sphere and then executed, usually by being burned at the stake. So it was the secular authorities who burned heretics, not the church, which is one of the major myths. It was actually against canon law to issue a death sentence to anybody in an ecclesiastical trial. And that's the other thing. I know we're belaboring this point, but the other real distinction, which we fail to realize when we talk about the Inquisition, that's difficult for modern people because we don't have the concept, is that at the time, right, there was two very clearly distinct legal systems. There's the ecclesiastical or canon law, and then there's secular law. That still exists today, but canon law is a little less prevalent and a little less well known than it was in the medieval period. And so you had the church had her own courts, her own legal process, different and separate from the secular world. And under canon law, those ecclesiastical courts could not give a death sentence. So no heretic was burned on orders of the church. Instead, those who were obstinate, refused to recant and repent, were remanded to the state, and then the state dealt with the heretic in their own way.
Yeah, an important distinction. And again, right, clarifying some very misunderstood aspects to history at that time. My last question for you is this. You end your survey of the Middle Ages on a kind of an ominous tone, right? Of course, we know what kind of comes next. The Reformation happens not too long after this, but you describe kind of with a melancholy way, in light of these popes and these anti-popes, kind of what comes next. And I think after the papal reform movements of the Middle Ages, the corruption doesn't seem to be quite all gone from the hierarchy. It's still there. Should we have expected it to be all gone? And does this kind of corruption that lingers, does that really serve as the foundation for kind of Luther's Reformation? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we touched on this earlier in terms of the church always needing reform, and especially people within the church, right, to be more authentic and more particular. We're all in need of individual reform and communal reform. We all are, like I mentioned earlier, we're all fallen yet redeemed creatures, and people in history are not any different from us in that respect. And so, yeah, you have for a period of time, right, the papal reform movement does produce great fruit, frankly, through the church for centuries. I think that the spiritual revolution we talked about earlier, the Dominicans and Franciscans, doesn't necessarily happen without at least some of that reform, at least some of the effects of the reform movement that you had in the earlier centuries, in the 11th and 12th centuries. And that interplay between church and state we talked on too, I think helps to bring that about. But yeah, when you get to the end of the book, right, I'm in the 14th century, and there's a crisis in the 14th century papacy, which really lays the groundwork and foundation, I think, for the later, Protestant reform or revolt, depending on how you want to phrase that. I have my own attitude on that, but we can have a different podcast on that later. So you have this crisis in the papacy. What's this crisis? Well, it first begins, which I do cover in the book, is the movement of the papal residents from Rome to Avignon. So you have the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is no longer living in Rome, right? He's living in the south of France. And he's participating now in an ecclesiastical abuse, which sadly had been pervasive in the church at that time, known as absenteeism, which is a bishop not living in his diocese. And so, it's one thing when a local bishop to do that, not good, it's still an abuse, but that's one thing, but not, scandalous, but not, not with universal impact. But for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to do that, that's pretty significant, right? It causes a huge scandal. I always like to say it's as if, Pope Francis tomorrow woke up and said, I don't like Rome. It's hot, humid in the summer. It's really not a nice place to live. Too much traffic, a lot of pollution. Let's go to Buenos Aires, which is no less probably, crowded and whatnot. But let's go back home to Argentina, right? I mean, people would obviously have issues with that. People would be concerned about it. It would cause great scandal. Catholic Twitter would blow up if that were to happen. So, so you can imagine now, right, how horrifying and difficult that would be now. It's difficult then too, and so it causes this loss of respect for the Pope, and they end up living there for 70 years. It's not like a short period. It's not a short temporary relocation. It's nearly a century. And then, the popes eventually come back to Rome through the actions of St. Catherine of Siena, really. And while they're there, and I end the book here because the next volume in this series will pick up the story there, you then have this what's known as the Great Western Schism, where you have cardinals who don't like the pope that they choose. Soon after, the residence moves back to Rome because he's a reformist pope, and he wants to cut back on some of the abuses and corruption in the church. And the cardinals at the time don't like that, and he's a bit heavy-handed and uncharitable in the way he does it, Urban VI. And so these cardinals gather together and say, well, we were forced by the Italian people to elect an Italian because they didn't want us to pick a Frenchman and have him move the residency back to Avignon. So, but we were forced to do that, so that election of Urban VI is null and void, and they elect a different guy. They elect a Frenchman who takes the name Clement VII, and so now you have an anti-pope. So it's not the first time in church history you have an anti-pope. The very first one was back in the 3rd century, St. Hippolytus, so the church has had anti-popes for numbers of times throughout her life. But what happens at this point, what makes it difficult, is that you have the secular rulers of Europe now begin to side with one claimant or the other. And so this now no longer becomes just a church thing, an ecclesiastical affair. It becomes a much greater political affair as well. And then eventually at one point, when you get to the 15th century, you have another pope, an anti-pope that's elected rather in Pisa. So you have 3 men claiming to be pope at the same time. You have 1 validly elected pope and 2 anti-popes. It's sometimes a complex story for historians to get straight. You can imagine, the average person trying to figure this out, and hearing things. So it makes for an interesting story, and it's obviously a great scandal and problem in the church. And the ultimate, effect of all of this 14th century crisis in the papacy is this loss of respect, a lack of resentment grows as well. During this time, the papacy the bureaucracy is very large. And so to finance that, popes institute taxes and the collection of revenue from church lands throughout Christendom. Kings and secular rulers are annoyed at that. They see all of this money that is generated from church land and revenue that goes to Rome. Why can't it stay here in France, for example, to help me, the king, fight my enemy, the English? And so kings begin to fight over this resources as well. And since the Pope no longer now has that level of unity and that level of respect that he used to occupy because of this crisis, that sows the seed of dissension, discord, disunity, and ultimately leads to the great Protestant revolt in the 16th century with Luther and Calvin and others.
Yeah, definitely sets the groundwork there, right? And yeah, and we'll have to. We've done a podcast, way back in the day, you and I on that topic, which was a fantastic one and still very popular in the archives. But a lot more to dig into there for sure. Thank you for this fantastic book, Steve. Thank you for being here. I could listen to you tell these stories all day long, so I think listeners will enjoy it too, and hopefully pick up some of your books. Where can they find them? Where can they find out more? You have a lecture series, all kinds of things that you've done, so people can get much more of you. Where can they find it, Steve?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have a website, so it's just my name, Steve Weidenkopf, all one word.com. So you can go there and see the different things that I've produced and written. The latest book, as you mentioned, the Church in the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile, is from Ave Maria Press. So you can go to avemariapress.com or to their website and get it. It's also available on Amazon. And last year I had my 1-volume narrative history of the Church, Timeless, come out from our Sunday visitors. You can go to their website as well, or mine, or Google it, and you'll find it there too.
Fantastic. Steve, I want to say thank you for being here. God bless you. God bless the fantastic work you are doing for the church. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate it. God bless.
God bless.